Welcome back, everyone. Today I would like to talk about scoring for video games versus scoring for film and television. What are the similarities? What are the differences? Let's start with the similarities. One similarity is that in both cases it's work for hire, in the sense that you are hired by a company, a studio that is developing something, and you are a contractor, sometimes employee, but usually contractor, that is hired to support said product that they are developing. So in neither case, you are an independent artist. In both cases, you are briefed by the creatives in charge. With video games, that would be the audio director or whoever they put in charge to fulfill the audio vision. In the case of film and television, it's either showrunners or executives or directors, producers that you're answering to. One similarity is also that when in video games you score cutscenes or cinematics, that's very, very similar, if not really actually the same as scoring scenes from a movie or a TV show. The initial workflow is also the same. You work off of the same template, the same products. You're not really changing the initial composition process. The recording and mixing pipeline is very similar as well. I'll get into differences later, but there aren't many. It's kind of the same orchestrators, copyists, the same type of recording. And then, the score mixers are kind of doing the same thing that they would with film and television. If there is thematic writing, it's used very similarly in both mediums. And another thing they have in common is that in video games as well as film and television, you have to be extremely flexible with your stylistic voice. So you can't just stick to one genre or one thing that you like to do. In both cases, you're required to constantly cross through styles, through genres, and mix and match. You're also going to have to know different production styles, not just different composition styles. So you're going to have to kind of be a chameleon in any of these mediums. And last but not least, the soundtrack release process is very similar as well. Now let's get into the differences, because this is actually the interesting part here. One major difference that I've experienced is that the schedules are just vastly different. So with video games, you usually have a lot of time. If you're scoring a full game and you're involved in the entire development cycle, that can be 2 or 3 years, sometimes even more. Whereas with film and television, usually you're involved much later in the process. And those schedules, usually for a feature film, you can get 3 months, maybe 6 months. Some of the bigger ones can be a year, maybe, but that's stretching it. The craziest schedules are usually in television. There you have like a week or two usually to score an entire episode of television, and it usually releases pretty much right after you're done scoring it. Every time I've worked on TV shows or TV movies, usually we're done very, very close to the release already. So the schedules are usually insane. TV movies as well. Usually those go in like 2-3 weeks, maybe a month. What that means is also that deadlines are handled very differently. In games, when you're scoring a whole game over the span of several years, deadlines are not usually hard deadlines. Like they're very movable on either end. So it's not really a big deal if you need an extra week for something, it's fine. As opposed to movies and television, if they've already been announced, which usually they have by the time you get involved, and they already have, a booked release, either on TV or in theaters, then you have to deliver exactly on time. So those are hard deadlines. There's no wiggle room. The release is already set in stone, so there's no, I need an extra week. Another difference that happens up front in the negotiations is usually that video games are often a buyout, as opposed to film and television, where you retain at least 50% of your rights, sometimes more. Now, I will say, in video games, usually the upfront pay is much higher than in film and television because they know there are no royalties and it's a buyout. Because in film and television, when you negotiate, you kind of calculate in that there's going to be payments later on as well as you retain rights. Some people are against buyouts. I don't mind it with games because there wouldn't really be royalties to begin with. They usually don't enter the music into the content ID on social media because the games need streamers to play the games and stay monetized, which they can't if they get copyright strikes on the music. And streamers are just the biggest advertising for games. So they can't do that. But also, when you buy a game and you play it on your computer, you don't really get royalties for that either. Much like if you buy a DVD or a Blu-ray and you play that on your player at home on your TV, there are no royalties from that either. So really the only time would be if it's performed in concert, I guess. But frankly, I'd rather take the higher upfront pay and then just not bank on hypothetical royalties that might come in someday in the future, because I can take that upfront pay already and then, invest it in the market and let it grow, as opposed to waiting for maybe in 10 years to have new regulations that would pay me royalties. However, in film and television, I would not give this up, because that's really where the money is. Theatrical runs outside of the US pay major bucks. Same with regular television. And then also, if you have a good movie on streaming services, they do pay quite a bit. Like, I've worked on several titles where the royalty payouts were actually higher than the entire music budget was. So a lot of these titles make their money back in royalties. So that makes a lot of composers actually a $0 line item, because the production company gets those royalties as well, because you only get 50%. So they basically make all of their money back that they invested up front in the music. We're cheap that way. Now, the pay structure is kind of different as well because of how spread out one schedule is versus the other. So in film and television, usually you get paid 50% up front and then 50% upon delivery, or sometimes it's split into 3 payments, but that's kind of it, because the schedule is so short that it's fine to do it that way. And then 3 quarters later, roughly, royalties would come in after the thing aired. And with games, it's very different. You basically set milestones up front. So you talk about what music needs to be done, and then you set specific dates by which you want to have these things done, and then every milestone triggers a payment. Because obviously you can't get 50% up front and then not get paid for 3 years and then get the other 50%. So it's usually like every 2 months or so you reach a milestone and it triggers a payment. Something I've also encountered a lot more in games is per minute rates. There are a lot more standard per minute rates for different types of games, especially if you do like little one-offs, like I did for Honor of Kings, for example. There is a set per minute rate that you just get paid. That doesn't really happen with film and television. You don't really get paid by the minute. It's just like one bulk. Either a package deal where you get the entire music budget and you have to distribute it, amongst recording and whatnot, or where you get your own fee and then the production company handles recording and other expenses. But either way, it's gonna be like one bulk fee that you just agree upon, and it doesn't really matter how many revisions, it doesn't really matter how, many minutes of music. Sometimes I get paid the same amount for a 30-minute score as for a 75-minute score. It's weird like that. There are no rules, there are no guidelines for film and television. It just kind of is what it is. Now, one difference I also noticed a lot more is when you are involved in the process. In games, I find that I'm involved a lot earlier in the process, unless it's for an ongoing online game. Obviously, then, it already exists. But if you're scoring a full game, then you can be involved before the game even exists. You start very early on. As they're developing the music system, you're already kind of in touch with them and you start writing themes, which makes for quite the lovely collaboration, I think, because you can influence each other. Sometimes a level is already done and I can see stuff or see artwork and things from the game, or even play through parts of the game already and get inspired by that. But sometimes I write the music for a level first, and then the people designing the level can get inspired by that. And sometimes the people developing the music system have new ideas based on what we're doing. So it's a much more back and forth process where the music can also be implemented, and then I can play it and see what works, what doesn't work, change it. Because the schedule is so spread out, you have time to go into a wrong direction or try things out, experiment. You don't really have that with film and television because it's so tight. There's no time to mess around much, especially because you're usually brought on during post-production. So at that point, the movie is already made. Everything is shot. They already have an edit by the time you're involved. You have a spotting session to either locked picture or almost locked picture, ideally. And so you're kind of already confronted with, people who have been working on this thing for months or a whole year already and are deeply familiar with it and already have ideas about what they want in it. And you kind of don't get this back and forth influence on each other. You're kind of more presented with an almost final product, and now they're like, add your thing to the product and we want it to be this particular thing, right? So there's a lot less freedom and a lot less experimentation, not just because you're involved so late in the process, but also because there's no time to do that. Another difference I've noticed between games and film and television is the people who brief you have very different backgrounds. So in film and television, you're usually briefed by people who don't really have a background in music, right? Some can communicate really well in music terms, or at least in what they want, and use the right words so I can translate that into music. Sometimes they can't communicate well at all musically because there's just no knowledge and they're lacking experience. So then it's a bit more difficult and you kind of have to play translator and figure out what they want. In games, I find it's very different because you are interfacing with the audio people, and they usually have a background either in music or in sound design. They're kind of more knowledgeable in audio in general. And so when you get feedback from them, it's just so much more detailed and much more spot on. There's very little guesswork when I get feedback from video game people, just because it's usually a music team or an audio team that you're interfacing with. And so they're coming from a much more technical background and a much more knowledgeable background in terms of how audio functions and how music functions. Something I've always felt when scoring for video games versus scoring for film and television, I always feel like when you have spotting sessions for film and television, usually you talk about what you want the audience to feel as an extension of the characters. So the audience is they're the onlookers, and you want to portray what the characters are feeling or what the atmosphere is, so that it kind of translates to the audience. But you're usually asking, what are the characters feeling? What is the situation, right? With games, it's much more personal because you're the main character. You're the one playing the game. You're in it. So there we ask ourselves, what do we want the player to feel in this moment? What do we want the player to experience? Because it's an immersive experience. So we're asking, how can we give the player the best experience? You're the immersive story driver in a game. You decide where the story goes. You decide what's going to happen, how you play the game. It's very different with movies, obviously, and television, where you're just an onlooker. You can't change what's going to happen on screen. You can feel with the characters, but there's nothing you can do to influence the story. Now, the biggest difference, I think, is linear scoring versus interactive scoring. Video games are constructed very differently from film and television. With film and television, you have a scene, you have a movie that exists in a linear format, and that is how you're scoring it. You're starting a scene, you have certain hit points that are hitting at exact moments, and you score the scene from start to finish, and that's it. Whereas with interactive scoring, it's very different in that since the player is deciding what happens and where they go and what they do, you can't really score in a linear fashion because you don't know what the player is going to do, right? Because everybody's going to play the game slightly differently. Everybody's going to do something different. Everybody's going to hang out in different areas longer, right? Maybe an area is designed for like 30 minutes, but a player spends 60 minutes there. So you never know. You never know what the players are going to do. So you have to design the music and the music implementation system in a way that can react to the player's choices. So usually what happens is that you work in layers and then have specific transitions, and you're going to have loops that can repeat. You have specific trigger points in the game. Once a player crosses a specific threshold, a specific music is triggered, or when they're in some kind of boss battle, right? The different Like the health of the enemy, for example, or your own health can influence how ramped up the music is. Or if you're in stealth mode, for example, you're trying to hide from enemies, you can have the music react to it when the player's almost discovered. So the music needs to constantly switch with whatever the player chooses to do. And so the best way to do that often is to design specific elements that all go with one another and that can quickly transition into one another. It takes some planning. It takes some back and forth, and also some back and forth with the audio team that's implementing it and seeing, does it work, does it not work? Where does the transition not work? What do we need to change so that it does work? Because you want mostly a seamless experience for the player. You don't want some rough implementation or some rough transitions that then just take the player out of the experience. Now, the amount of music is also very different. If you're scoring a full game, depending on the length of the game, you're going to be writing hours upon hours of music, for sure. As opposed to, movies, usually a feature film, if it has a ton of songs, like if it's a rom-com that has a ton of songs in it, licensed songs, then the score can be like 30 minutes, right? Normally, like a 90-minute film will have about 75 minutes of music in it. So it's roughly that, unless it's a really long movie. Obviously, if it's a 2 or 3 hour movie, you're going to have substantially more music in it. But, you will never really reach the amount of music that you would reach in a game, not even with revisions and conforms. Because that happens in movies a lot more, where they change the cut and you have to go into cues and change them, right? And have revisions and make changes for the linear medium. That doesn't happen so much with games, I feel. But even with that, you're not really reaching the amount of music of games usually. This also has an effect on recording. Usually when we record film scores, very often we record them, in one block and just it's done. With games, what you have a lot more often is that it's recorded in various different locations and that it's recorded over really long periods of time. The same with the mixing. Sometimes the mixer will just mix one bulk thing and then there's a huge pause and then they're going to mix the next bulk of pieces. So it's much more common to just have so many different locations and different musicians on a game recording. The same thing can happen with television. It's not that common, but if it's a bigger TV show that just takes years to make, then it can happen that, they're recording choir here and the orchestra there, but then they're going here for some specific instruments and then they're recording some stuff at home. In TV, it can happen if it's a big show that stretches over long periods of time. Now, as far as deliverables go, they're very different for film, television, and video games. For film and television, if you're delivering to a mixer, to a score mixer, you would deliver much more split out dry stems. But if you're delivering to the dub stage, to the final movie mix, you're delivering much rougher stems, like you would have a string stem and a brass stem, and you would usually split out the instrument groups and soloists and whatever makes sense with the score. You usually communicate with the dub stage and ask them how much mixing time do you have. The more time they have, the more stems you can give them, and they will tell you exactly what they want. Usually we deliver in surround, sometimes Atmos, but it's not yet that common, except for big budget stuff, obviously. For TV movies, we actually sometimes also just deliver in stereo. So that is what they're gonna do. And then they spend somewhere between 2 days to several weeks on the dub stage, mixing, carefully mixing dialogue, sound effects, music, and, in surround. And they're gonna very carefully EQ stuff and make sure everything is kind of meshing very well, that you can hear everything. In games, it's quite different. Our deliverables there are more music bound, I want to say. They're much more layers and transitions and little building blocks. And they're layers that make sense. So it's usually intensity layers and not split out by instruments necessarily. It's really more what makes musically sense in that part. That is going to go into one stem. And the audio team is going to tell you exactly what they're going to need for the implementation. There's also a specific way to make loops, though that has changed a little bit because they can now do a lot more things in the implementation that previously couldn't easily be done. There's a lot more assets. there's like 1,000 little files that you're delivering and uploading for them that have to be labeled a specific way. I mean, naming conventions are a thing in both cases, but with film and television, you know, you're delivering inside a Proto session with everything already lined up to the picture anyway. So not much can go wrong if you do that. But with games, there's so many tiny assets that you're delivering that you're gonna have to be really careful that everything works correctly. Because if something isn't right, then, you know, they're gonna have to find that mistake in a sea of tiny little files that you've delivered. Now, as I've already mentioned, at the dub mix for film and television, they usually carefully mix the whole thing from start to finish. With games, it's a lot more, since you don't know exactly when a line of dialogue is going to happen exactly, there's a lot more ducking happening. So basically in the audio system, when there's dialogue, the music and sound effects will dip out a little bit to make room for the dialogue. Because you can't really do too much in advance, because you don't know when the player is exactly going to arrive at wherever the dialogue is happening, right? Or whenever the player chooses to make some noise with something, right? Whenever a fight breaks out. It happens at different points, right? The music can be at any point, so it has to work regardless. So you're doing a lot more automated systems where if this happens, then the volume of this element goes down. The same can happen with EQing as well. So you can automate a lot of things in games to make room for whatever needs to be in the forefront in that moment. And with games, I also feel like I have to stay backwards compatible for much longer, because if you're working on something for 2 years, you can't really update your system too much, because then you're going to have to go into whatever cues you did 1.5 years ago and port them over into your updated template and stuff. This would normally be an assistant task, but if you don't have a full-time assistant, then you're going to have to do that yourself. I try to avoid it. I try to not update these things in the middle of a project, but it's much harder to do when you're on a project that lasts 2 years, right? As opposed to with movies, it's not that important to stay backwards compatible, because if they only last like 3 months or 1 month, it doesn't really matter. Like in that time frame, I also wouldn't make updates, but then usually once the movie is done, I will update my template and, you know, maybe update software and stuff like that. But with games, I feel like I can't do that as much. Or I have to do it over holidays where I know I have time to test things out and make sure everything's still working and nothing's really interfering with anything. Now, this one's going to be a little controversial, but I find that there is a difference in how composer teams are handled. In film and television, we still have this weird mystical thing that we believe there's just one composer, the one genius who, you know, makes up everything. Whereas with video games, I feel like it's so much more rooted in teamwork. There's so many games, especially online games, that just go on and on for decades. At that point, dozens, if not hundreds of people have touched the music and written something for the game. So I feel like it's much more common and much more welcomed in games to just have teams of people. It's much more normalized than in film and television, which also means that in film and television, we still have the issue that there are still composers to this day, for whatever reason, that still want to keep up this myth of the one single composer, and so they hide their teams, essentially. Sometimes they will give some bullshit credit, or they will, you know, give some credit in the end credits or something, even though sometimes the teams actually write more on the thing than the composer themselves, but they will still take the front credit and just pretend like they did all the work, which is unfortunate. I mean, I've spoken about this before. At least if those writers are on the cue sheet, they can get royalties, which can be quite chunky in film and TV, but it's not helpful for their career if their name doesn't appear on the thing. So yeah, that's still a thing. 2025, and it's still a thing. I find that to be a lot less in games. Like, there's just not this weird stigma, I think. Now, in games, you also sometimes have in-house employees at the bigger game companies, though contractors are more common than in-house employees. With film composers, it's pretty much all contractors. There's a couple of library houses that have some employees, but for the most part, they all have their own company and contract through that loan out company. Now, another thing that happens a bit more in games is cancellations. Even if, they're already working on the game, that halfway through a game can actually just be canceled, which doesn't really happen with movies because once the movie is shot, you might as well finish it, right? We've had a couple of instances with especially Warner Brothers Discovery where somehow movies that were fully finished and ready to go were shelved, but that's not the norm. That was kind of a weird time where they did that for a very short time, but that's not something that we normally do. Because at that point you've spent the money, so now you might as well finish it and release it and just try and make at least some of that money back. And who knows, maybe it's a surprise hit. So with games, it's much more common. I know so many games that were canceled where the team had already worked on it for like a year. And then out of nowhere, they were just like, no, actually, we're just not gonna produce this game anymore. Another thing that I find about games is they're announced way later in the process. Because it's such a long development process that they have a tentative release window. But so much can happen in that amount of time that they're just like, we'll announce it when we're close to being done. Like usually when the stuff is announced, they're already testing it, right? It's already being play tested and the last bugs are being fixed. That's when the game is announced, which is kind of difficult sometimes for PR purposes because you can't talk about it for years, what you're working on. As opposed to film and TV, usually by the time you get involved, the trailer is already out, or the TV schedules are already done, or a release date has been announced already. So the project is coming and you have to get it done. They're not very flexible with the release. Unless it's an indie film that goes onto streaming, then sometimes you can be flexible. In games, really, the only time you have really strict release dates is when you're working, for example, on an online game that has a special event for a holiday. Obviously, then it has to be done for the holiday. Or if it's an esports event, right, that has a specific date, then it needs to be done. But otherwise, it's pretty flexible. Film and TV, not so much. They're very strict with when things need to get done. Another thing I find is that film and television is much more localized because they need a specific infrastructure. So there are only a couple of, cities where film and TV production is happening in large numbers, as opposed to games where I find that they're really spread out. There is a lot generally in California, and there's a lot in Seattle. But overall, I feel like game studios are very spread out across continents, really. Every game company I work with, they're just located in a completely different location. So there's not really, I find, a central place where you can go if you want to work in games. And one last thing is that a common misconception, because media scoring is lumped together, so video games and film are lumped together, is that the crowd overlaps. It doesn't. Video game composers are very often not necessarily at the same events as film and television composers. There are exceptions, of course, but usually the crowd doesn't overlap. If I'm going to a video game event, there are almost no film composers except for, people like me who do both. And when I go to a film and TV event, very rarely do I see video game composers at those. And the studios, like the executives, don't overlap either. Like game developers do not overlap with the film studios. The only time that happens is if a film studio acquires the rights to a game because they want to make like a TV show or something. But outside of that, this doesn't really happen. So they're very different crowds. So if you are an aspiring composer, aspiring media composer, I would pick one first, one of the two, so that you can focus on which events to go to and who to network with, right? Because it's just, there's so little overlap between the two. Now, what do I like better? I don't know. I got into this for film and television. I stumbled at the very beginning of my career into video games, then deliberately got out of it because I really wanted to do film and TV, and did that for the better part of 10 years. And then I kind of stumbled back into video games, and I don't know what happened. If I maybe fell a little out of love with film and television, or if I just fell back in love with video games. But yeah, I started to enjoy it a little bit more. So I don't know. I think creatively, I do like video games more, just because there's more freedom, there's more time, right? With film and TV, very often you're pulling the all-nighters and you have all these crazy deadlines and everybody expects revision number 6 tomorrow morning, right? And it can be very adrenaline driven. With video games, I feel like it's much more relaxed and much more, let me try out this thing and see if it works. So that way you stumble upon a couple more interesting things, I think. Whereas in film and television, I find myself falling back into cliches and things that I know instead of trying something new just because there's no time. So yeah, I don't know. At the same time, I love movies and TV shows. I love linear storytelling. So I don't think I'll ever get out of it, but I definitely want to split my time 50-50 between film and video games. Because I don't know what happened, but for the past couple of years, my love for video games has really rekindled, and I just want to stay involved in that because it's just incredible fun. I hope this was helpful, and as per usual, go practice.